Today I'm going to make a start on building a new mobile table saw stand for my DeWalt DW745 as part of my workshop remodeling. I had a rough design in mind and I'd already drawn a 3D model in SketchUp. I want the table saw to be at the same height as my workbench so that I can use the workbench as an outfeed table. My workbench is 963mm high, so that's the height I want the table saw's table to be at. I want a small extension table which will give me more work surface and also make it easier to rip sheet materials. I want somewhere to store all my table saw jigs like the crosscut sled, frame spline and tenon jigs. I want a couple of drawers to store table saw accessories like push sticks. I also want space to add a second shop vac to my workshop that will be permanently hooked up to the table saw. I needed to find a shop vac that was under 523mm tall in order for it to fit underneath the table saw on the stand. And that was quite tricky because a lot of the manufacturers don't actually list the dimensions of the shop vacs on their websites. But I did manage to find a 30-litre vacuum in my local Screwfix. And without either the handle or the wheels attached, it looked like it would just about fit. 52cm high. As always, I'm just going to use salvaged wood for this build, and I've got some plywood left over from other projects, so I'll pull out what I think is usable and measure it up. I'd already written down some measurements from the SketchUp drawing, so I went ahead and cut the plywood panels to size. I clamped down a straight edge and used my circular saw to make the rip cuts. I made the cross cuts on the miter saw as I find it gives a much cleaner cut than my circular saw for cross-grain cuts. I had to flip the pieces and make 2 cuts to get all the way through the boards. I didn't have any more pieces of plywood that were long enough to make the central shelf, but I did have a piece of melamine, so I used that. As this is just for the workshop, I'm not too worried about everything matching. I'm going to start assembly now. This is the bottom panel, this is the right panel, this is the left panel, and this is the central shelf. And I'm going to use the central shelf to help keep everything square. I applied glue, drilled pilot holes, and then screwed in some drywall screws. The distance between the bottom of the table saw and the table saw's table is 328mm. So to find the right height for this shelf, I'm going to measure 288mm. Then when I add the 40mm worktop on the extension table, it should be perfectly flush with the table saw's table. Next I added the centre shelf. I used a speed square to help keep the shelf square to the sides while driving in the screws. To get the right height for this side of the shelf, I'm just going to measure from the bottom on this side that's already fitted, 523mm, and now I'll screw this side in at 523. I'm going to use a clamp here just to help position it. I measured and made some reference marks to make sure that I drove the screws into the shelf rather than above or below it. I've cut another piece of plywood to act as a central divider down the bottom here, and I'll just glue and screw that in place. I took the table saw off the old stand and I was surprised at how much sawdust had built up under there. I added the casters that I had removed from the old table saw stand to the bottom of the new stand using some screws and brass washers. So with the table saw on the new stand, I've run into a bit of a problem. I must have measured the distance between the bottom of the table saw and where this switch is while the switch was up. So I'll need to cut a couple of centimetres off the top of this right hand side panel. I wanted to get a nice clean cut here, and my circular saw cuts on the upstroke, so to get a clean cut I used a Stanley knife and a steel ruler and cut a knife wall across the grain, and then I also added some tape to help prevent tear out. Then I made the cut and I was surprised at how well that worked. The cut was perfectly clean. I used a hand plane to help straighten up the edge that I'd just cut. Because I'm still not 100% sure that the new layout is going to work, I'm going to actually move things around now and put the table saw and the workbench where I want it to be to see how it fits and get a feel for the space. Ideally, what I would do is clear all of that wood along that back wall outside, so I've got space to move things around, but obviously it's raining again, so I don't want to put everything outside because it'll get wet, so I'm just going to juggle things around internally as best I can. I need to move my workbench next, and this thing is heavy, so I think I'll remove the drawers first. Cannot get those two chests of drawers out. The trouble with this thing is it wasn't designed to be moved. I eventually got the workbench to where it needs to be, and I've got the table saw stand positioned in front of it. The space is a little bit tight either side of the workbench, but I still think that this layout is going to be an improvement on what I've currently got, so I'm going to go with it. The next thing that I want to do is to add this piece of plywood which will support the worktop. I just need to cut this to the same height as this piece here. I want the ability to be able to fit some drawers here later on, so I want to make sure that this panel is spaced evenly at the front and at the back, and also at the bottom and at the top. So I've cut a couple of spacers and I'll use these to position the side panel. Now I can screw this piece in place from underneath. So the panel's now secured from the bottom, and to secure it at the top, I think I'm actually going to use these spacers and just screw them in from each side like so. I can then later secure the worktop just by screwing through these into the worktop from underneath. I've got an offcut of kitchen worktop here that I'm going to use to make the little extension table next to the table saw. This was left over when I fitted my kitchen last year. So I've got the worktop placed where I want it, and I've just double checked that it doesn't interfere with the fence mechanism which passes on both sides of the worktop. So I think I'm ready to secure that down. I've got some pieces of wood here that came from an old futon bed. I'm not sure what type of wood this is. I'm going to use it to trim the edges of this worktop.